The rain poured down heavily over New York City, transforming the bustling streets into a maze of glistening reflections. Emily, soaked despite her umbrella, stood on the curb, desperately waving for a cab. She glanced at her watch and sighed. Late again. The interview she was heading to felt like the most important opportunity of her life, and of course, the city's unpredictable weather had to get in the way. Just as another taxi zoomed past without stopping, Emily's eyes fell on a man standing a few feet away. He was impeccably dressed in a dark, tailored suit, his hair slicked back, and his expression distant, almost bored. His presence exuded confidence, the kind that came from a life of success. He caught her looking and offered a small, polite nod. Embarrassed, Emily quickly averted her gaze, but before she could turn away, he stepped forward. "Need a ride?" he asked, his voice smooth but carrying a hint of kindness. "Looks like neither of us will be getting a cab anytime soon." Caught off guard by his offer, Emily hesitated. Yeah, I'm trying to get to Midtown. Job interview. Very important." The man smiled slightly and gestured to the street. "We're in the same direction. Let's share. It'll save us both the headache." Within minutes, a sleek black car pulled up. It wasn't a cab, it was a private driver. The man opened the door and gestured for her to enter. Emily paused, uncertainty flickering across her face. But something about his demeanor, polite yet distant, made her feel like she could trust him. She nodded in thanks and slid into the back seat. As the car moved smoothly through the rain-drenched streets, Emily allowed herself to relax for a moment, the tension from the chaotic morning beginning to fade. The man beside her remained silent, his gaze fixed on the window, lost in thought. She couldn't help but wonder who he was. His clothes, the car, the quiet power he seemed to hold. It was clear he wasn't just another New Yorker struggling to catch a cab. After a few moments of silence, curiosity got the better of her. "Thanks again for the ride," she said, glancing at him. "I would have been soaked and definitely late without it." The man turned to her, his blue eyes sharp but not unkind. "Don't mention it," he said. "It's Jason, by the way. Jason Blackwell." The name hit her like a jolt. Jason Blackwell, a name she had seen in magazines, headlines, and the business sections of newspapers. He was one of the wealthiest men in the country, known for his empire of luxury hotels and real estate. What were the odds that she'd end up sharing a car with him? She tried to maintain her composure, but the recognition must have shown on her face because Jason gave a small, knowing smile. "Yeah, that Jason Blackwell," he said, his tone amused. Emily let out a nervous laugh. "I'm sorry, I just wasn't expecting to meet, you." Jason waved it off. "No need to apologize. I'm just another guy stuck in the rain." They shared a quiet chuckle, and for a moment, the conversation seemed lighter, almost casual. But something about Jason still intrigued her. There was a tension in him, a subtle edge that made her feel like there was more beneath the surface. He carried the air of someone used to getting what he wanted. Yet there was something missing. The car glided through the rain, and before Emily could think of what to say next, Jason adjusted his cuff, revealing a glimpse of his wrist. Her eyes widened slightly as she noticed something unusual. A small, faded birthmark on the inside of his wrist, shaped almost like a star. For a split second, her heart skipped a beat. That mark, she had seen it before. Not on him, but on her mother. Sarah had the exact same birthmark on her wrist, a small, nearly identical star shape. It was something they had joked about when she was younger, calling it their family's secret mark. Shaking off the strange coincidence, Emily forced herself to focus on the conversation. "So, what takes you to Midtown?" she asked, trying to keep her tone light. Jason glanced at her, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing how much to reveal. "Business, mostly," he said simply. "I have a few meetings to attend." The silence that followed felt heavier this time, and Emily couldn't shake the feeling that there was more going on beneath the surface. She didn't know what, but something about Jason, and that birthmark, stirred a strange, nagging feeling in the back of her mind. As the car pulled up to her destination, she thanked him again and stepped out. But the thought of that mark stayed with her, lingering as the rain continued to fall around her. The interview had gone well, better than Emily could have imagined. But as she left the building, she found herself unable to focus on the success. Her mind kept drifting back to Jason and that unmistakable birthmark on his wrist. It was such a small detail, but the way it mirrored her mother's mark was unsettling, as if some invisible thread connected them. As she made her way through the busy streets of New York, the rain had finally let up, leaving behind a cool breeze that carried the scent of wet pavement. Emily pulled her phone from her bag and dialed her mom's number. It rang a few times before Sarah's warm voice came through. "Hey, sweetie, how did it go?" her mother asked, the usual cheerfulness in her tone. "The interview was great," Emily said, trying to sound as enthusiastic as she should have been. "I think I have a real shot at the job." "I knew you would. You've been working so hard. You deserve it." Emily smiled, but there was still a knot in her stomach she couldn't shake. After a brief pause, she took a breath and said, "Mom, can I ask you something weird?" There was a slight hesitation on the other end of the line. "Of course. What's on your mind?" "Well, it's about your birthmark, the one on your wrist," Emily began, her voice soft. "You've always said it was a unique thing in our family, right? Has anyone else in our family had it? Like, I don't know, Dad, maybe?" The mention of her father brought an immediate shift in Sarah's tone. "Emily, why are you asking about this all of a sudden?" I met someone today," Emily continued, trying to explain without sounding too paranoid. "He had the same exact mark. It was uncanny. Same shape, same spot on the wrist. I don't know, it just struck me as odd." There was a long silence on the other end of the line. Too long. "Mom." Finally, Sarah spoke, her voice low, almost strained. "That's impossible." "Why?" "I mean, birthmarks aren't that rare," Emily said, but she could feel her heart speeding up. Her mother's reaction was not what she had expected. Sarah sighed, a deep, tired sound that Emily had only heard a few times in her life. "It's just, no one in our family has that mark except for me. It's complicated." Emily frowned, stopping in the middle of the sidewalk as pedestrians hurried past. "Complicated how? You've never said anything about it before?" "Because it's not important," Sarah said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "Emily, don't get caught up in this. Whoever you met, it's just a coincidence." "But Mom." "Emily, drop it. Please." The harshness of her mother's words took Emily by surprise. Sarah had always been open with her, the kind of mom who encouraged questions, who never dismissed her curiosity. But now, it was like she had hit a brick wall. "Okay, fine," Emily said, feeling a mix of frustration and confusion. "I'll drop it." There was a brief pause before her mother's voice softened again. "I'm sorry, sweetie. There are things from the past that are better left alone. That's all." Emily didn't know what to say to that. "All right, I'll see you tonight for dinner?" "Of course. We'll talk more then. Okay?" Sarah replied, her tone lighter now, as if trying to mend the tension between them. "Yeah, sure. Bye, Mom." Emily hung up and stood still for a moment, staring at her phone. Something about the way her mom had reacted didn't sit right with her. It was more than just discomfort, it was fear. And that wasn't like Sarah at all. As she started walking again, Emily's mind raced with questions. Who was Jason Blackwell, really? Why did he have the same birthmark as her mother? And why had her mom been so rattled by it? That evening, as she prepared to head to her mother's apartment for dinner, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that she was on the verge of uncovering something significant, something her mother had been hiding for a long time. But how deep did that secret go? The rest of the night felt like a blur. She barely tasted the food as she sat across from Sarah, who kept the conversation light, asking about the job interview and ignoring any mention of their earlier phone call. Emily played along, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Finally, as she gathered her things to leave, she turned to her mother one last time. "Mom, are you sure you don't want to talk about the birthmark thing?" Sarah's eyes darkened for a split second, and her smile faltered. "Not tonight, Emily." "Okay," Emily said softly, giving her a quick hug before heading out the door. As she stepped into the crisp night air, Emily knew that something was terribly wrong. Her mother was hiding something, and if she wanted answers, she'd have to find them herself. With Jason Blackwell's name still lingering in her mind, Emily decided that it was time to dig deeper. Whatever was going on, It wasn't just a coincidence, and she wasn't about to let it go. The next morning, Emily awoke with a sense of determination she hadn't felt in a long time. She couldn't shake the feeling that something vital was just out of her reach, a truth that her mother had buried and Jason unknowingly resurfaced. Lying in bed, she stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The nagging feeling from the previous day had only intensified overnight, growing louder with each passing hour. Emily knew she couldn't let it go, not now. She reached for her phone and hesitated. Should she try to call her mother again? No, that wouldn't get her anywhere. Sarah had made it clear she wasn't ready to talk. But if her mother wasn't going to provide answers, maybe someone else could. Emily's thoughts drifted back to Jason Blackwell. If he had any connection to her family, he might not even know it himself. But he was the only lead she had. She opened her laptop and started searching his name. Already aware of his public persona, but looking for something deeper, something personal. As expected, most of the results were about his empire. Luxury hotels, charitable foundations, and business deals worth millions. Nothing unusual, but not what she was looking for either. Emily scrolled through article after article, but there was no mention of his family background. No details about his parents, siblings, or childhood. It was like he had appeared out of nowhere, already a success. Frustrated but unwilling to give up, she typed in Jason Blackwell family history. Her heart skipped a beat when she found a few results. Old newspaper clippings from small towns on the outskirts of New York. One headline from nearly 30 years ago stood out. Asterisk, son of prominent family disappears. Blackwell heir missing after tragedy. Asterisk. Emily clicked on the link and scanned the article. It mentioned a family named Blackwell, Jason's parents, who had lived in a large estate upstate. But when Jason was just a boy, there had been a fire. His mother had died, and his father, devastated, disappeared from the public eye. Jason had been sent to live with distant relatives, but after that, there was no more information. The article didn't mention anything about a birthmark or a connection to her mother, but it was clear that Jason's life had been far from simple. Just as she was about to close her laptop, her phone buzzed. A message from her best friend, Lisa, appeared on the screen. Asterisk, hey, brunch tomorrow? Haven't seen you in forever. Asterisk. Emily glanced at the message, but didn't reply. She had too many things swirling around her mind right now, and socializing was the last thing on her list. Instead, she leaned back in her chair, staring at the article. Jason's past was clearly more complicated than she had imagined, but there was still something missing, something her mother knew and refused to talk about. That afternoon, she found herself standing in front of her mother's old storage unit. Sarah had rented it years ago to store things from their past. Boxes of childhood photos, old letters, and mementos from their family history. Emily hadn't been there in years, but if anyone could shed light on her mother's secrets, it was her late grandmother. Emily remembered her grandmother talking about their family in cryptic, half-remembered stories, especially when it came to her mother's younger days. The musty smell of cardboard and dust filled the air as Emily unlocked the door and pulled up the metal gate. The unit was packed from floor to ceiling with boxes and crates, the remnants of lives that seemed distant and forgotten. She stepped inside, her heart pounding as she looked through the faded labels on each box, searching for any clue that might help her understand what her mother was hiding. After what felt like hours, Emily found a box marked simply, Sarah, College, in her mother's familiar handwriting. She pulled it down and set it on the floor, carefully opening it. Inside, there were photos, dozens of them, from her mother's college days. Some showed her at parties with friends, others were of Sarah hiking and traveling. And then, at the very bottom, Emily found something that stopped her cold. It was a letter. Yellowed with age, the envelope was addressed to her mother from someone named Jay. Emily's fingers trembled as she opened it, pulling out the folded piece of paper inside. The handwriting was neat, almost formal. Asterisk, Sarah, I wish things were different. I know we've both made decisions we can't take back, and maybe this is for the best. I'm leaving for good. But know that you and the child will always be in my thoughts, even if I can never be part of your lives. Take care of her. I hope one day you'll forgive me. J. Asterisk. Emily's heart raced as she read the letter again, her mind spinning. The child? Could the letter be talking about her? And the signature, *J star. Jason? Was it possible? She stared at the letter, trying to piece it all together. Was Jason Blackwell her father? Had her mother hidden this from her all her life? Her breath quickened, and her mind raced with 100 questions. It couldn't be a coincidence. The birthmark, her mother's reaction, the letter. It all pointed to one terrifying possibility. Jason wasn't just some millionaire who happened to give her a ride. He was part of her past, part of a life her mother had tried to bury. Without thinking, Emily grabbed the letter and rushed out of the storage unit, her pulse pounding in her ears. She needed to find Jason. She needed answers, now. As she stepped back into the cool evening air, her phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Lisa. It was an unknown number. Emily hesitated for a moment before answering. Hello? A familiar voice came through the line, calm but with an edge of urgency. Emily, it's Jason. We need to talk. Her heart skipped a beat, and she could barely find her voice. How did you get my number? I have my ways, he replied, his tone darkening. But that's not important. What's important is that I think we're both looking for the same thing. Emily gripped the letter tightly in her hand. She could hear the tension in his voice, and for the first time, she realized that whatever secrets her mother had been hiding, Jason knew more than he was letting on. Meet me at the park by 7th Avenue in an hour, Jason said before hanging up abruptly. Emily stood there, the phone still pressed to her ear, her mind reeling. There was no turning back now. Whatever was waiting for her, it was going to change everything. Emily's mind raced as she made her way to the park on 7th Avenue. The sun had set, and the city was bathed in the golden hues of streetlights, their glow stretching across the wet pavement. She clutched the letter in her jacket pocket, the paper crinkling under the weight of her grip. The letter had raised more questions than it answered, and Jason's cryptic call only added to the mounting tension. What did he know? How long had he known? And why was her mother so terrified of confronting the truth? The park wasn't far, but the walk felt like an eternity. Every step echoed louder in her mind, each thought more jumbled than the last. She had no idea what Jason would say, or what she would even ask. The only thing she knew for sure was that this meeting could change everything she thought she knew about her life. As she approached the park entrance, the sound of the city faded into the background. The quiet of the park was unsettling, a stark contrast to the noise and chaos of New York. Jason stood beneath one of the lampposts, his silhouette tall and composed. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in the way he held himself. He hadn't seen her yet, and Emily took a moment to steady her nerves. She had to be prepared for whatever was about to happen. Taking a deep breath, she stepped forward. Jason. He turned at the sound of her voice, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. They just stood there, the silence stretching between them, thick with unspoken questions. Finally, Jason broke the silence. I didn't want to involve you in this, Emily. Her brow furrowed. Involve me in what exactly? She asked, her voice firmer than she felt inside. You called me. You wanted to meet. Jason's gaze dropped for a second, as if gathering his thoughts. I didn't know. I didn't know you existed, he said quietly. Not until recently. Emily's heart skipped. What do you mean? You didn't know I existed? I didn't know Sarah kept you a secret, he said, his voice heavy with regret. All those years, I had no idea. I thought, he paused, swallowing hard. I thought she made a different choice. Emily's pulse quickened. Her grip tightened on the letter. Are you saying you're my father? Her voice trembled, the words almost choking her. Jason met her eyes, and in that moment, the truth was laid bare. Yes, he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. I'm your father. The ground beneath her seemed to shift. She took a step back, the world tilting around her. This man, this stranger she'd met by chance in the rain. He was her father? The reality of it was too surreal, too overwhelming to process. How could you not know? She stammered, her voice thick with emotion. How could my mother keep something like this from you? From me? Jason ran a hand through his hair, his usual calm demeanor cracking under the weight of the conversation. We were young, Emily. It was complicated. I thought she didn't want this life, didn't want me. We had plans, but everything changed. Emily's mind raced. It all made sense now. The way her mother had reacted, the secrecy, the strange tension in their past. But it didn't make it easier to accept. You just left her? Emily asked, her voice trembling with a mix of anger and confusion. How could you abandon her like that? Like us? Jason's face tightened. It wasn't like that. I didn't abandon her. Your mother made choices, and so did I. I thought it was over. I thought, he trailed off, struggling to find the right words. I was young too, Emily, and scared. Emily stared at him, disbelief and hurt mixing in her chest. She didn't even tell me about you. Why? Her voice cracked, and she could feel the tears threatening to spill over. Jason looked pained. I don't know. Maybe she thought she was protecting you. Maybe she was protecting herself. But I swear, if I'd known about you, about any of this, I wouldn't have stayed away. A long silence fell between them, broken only by the occasional sound of a distant car passing by. Emily didn't know what to say. Her world had flipped upside down, and she felt like she was drowning in a sea of emotions she didn't know how to process. After a moment, Jason stepped closer, his expression softening. I know this is a lot to take in, and I don't expect you to forgive me, but I want you to know, I'm not going anywhere. Not now. Emily looked away, her thoughts swirling. She had spent her whole life believing one story, and now, in the span of a single day, everything had been rewritten. She felt lost, unmoored, unsure of who she even was anymore. Jason must have sensed her turmoil, because he didn't press further. I know this is hard, he said gently, but you deserve the truth. No more secrets, no more lies. Emily let out a shaky breath, finally meeting his eyes again. I don't even know where to start. You don't have to figure it all out tonight, Jason said softly, but we can take it one step at a time, together. The weight of his words hung in the air, and for the first time since this whirlwind began, Emily felt a small glimmer of something she hadn't expected, hope. It was fragile, barely there, but it was enough to keep her standing. I need time, she whispered, her voice almost breaking. I don't know what to feel right now. Jason nodded, understanding. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready. With that, Emily turned and began to walk away, her mind still spinning. But as she left the park, one thing was clear. This was only the beginning. There were still so many unanswered questions, so many pieces of the puzzle that didn't quite fit. And somehow, she knew the truth would be far more complicated than she had ever imagined. The days after that night in the park passed in a blur for Emily. She went through the motions of her life, but nothing felt the same. The revelation that Jason Blackwell, this stranger she had barely met, was her father had shattered her sense of reality. She couldn't look at her mother the same way, couldn't shake the feeling that her entire life had been built on lies. Emily hadn't told her mother about the meeting yet. Every time she thought about confronting Sarah, her chest tightened. How could she even begin that conversation? How could she ask her mother why she had hidden such a monumental truth? Her mind felt like a tangled knot of emotions, anger, confusion, sadness, and underneath it all, a small, fragile thread of hope. She still didn't know how to feel about Jason. He was a part of her now, a piece of her history she never knew existed. But what did that mean for her future? It was late Saturday afternoon when Emily finally decided she couldn't avoid it any longer. Her mother had invited her over for dinner, and she knew it was time to confront the truth. The letter she had found in the storage unit weighed heavily in her purse, a silent reminder of the past neither of them could run from anymore. When she arrived at her mother's apartment, the familiar warmth of the place only added to her sense of unease. The smell of her mother's cooking filled the air, and Sarah greeted her with a bright smile, as if everything was normal. Hey, sweetie, you're just in time. I made your favorite, lasagna, Sarah said, her tone cheerful, though her eyes seemed to search Emily's face as if sensing something was wrong. Emily forced a smile, her heart racing. Smells great, Mom, she said, her voice tight. She followed Sarah into the kitchen, trying to hold herself together. They ate in relative silence, the clinking of forks against plates the only sound in the room. Every bite felt heavy in Emily's stomach, the tension between them growing thicker with every passing second. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Emily couldn't take it anymore. She set down her fork and looked directly at her mother. "Mom, we need to talk." Sarah froze, her expression faltering. "What's wrong, honey?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. Emily reached into her bag and pulled out the letter. She slid it across the table, watching as Sarah's face drained of color the moment her eyes landed on it. "What is this?" Sarah's voice was barely a whisper, but Emily could hear the panic underneath. "I found it in the storage unit," Emily said, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I think it's time you told me the truth, Mom. About Jason. About everything." Sarah's hands shook as she picked up the letter, her eyes scanning the words. For a long moment, she didn't say anything. The silence stretched, thick and suffocating, until finally, Sarah set the letter down and looked at Emily with a pained expression. "I was hoping you'd never have to know," Sarah said softly, her voice filled with regret. "Know what?" Emily's voice cracked. "That Jason Blackwell is my father? That you lied to me my entire life?" Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, and she reached out as if to comfort her daughter, but Emily pulled back, her heart aching too much to allow it. "I didn't lie to you, Emily. Sarah paused, struggling for words. "I was trying to protect you." Emily's chest tightened. "Protect me? From what, Mom? From him?" Sarah wiped at her eyes, her face crumbling under the weight of her own guilt. "Jason wasn't always the man he is now. When we were younger, things were complicated. We loved each other, but his family didn't approve of me. They wanted him to marry someone else, someone who could help their business. I was a nobody in their eyes." Emily felt a pang of sympathy, but it was quickly overshadowed by her need for answers. "That doesn't explain why you kept me from him." Sarah took a deep breath, her voice trembling. "When I found out I was pregnant, Jason and I had already started drifting apart. His family was pressuring him, and I knew if I told him about you, he'd be forced to choose between us and his family's legacy. I didn't want that burden on him, and honestly, I was scared. Scared he wouldn't choose us." Emily's heart ached as she listened to her mother's words. It was the first time she had seen her mother so vulnerable, so raw, but the pain of being kept in the dark for so long still stung. "So, you just decided for both of us?" Emily asked, her voice shaking. "You thought it was better that I never knew my father?" Sarah's tears fell freely now. "I thought I was doing the right thing, Emily. I wanted to give you a normal life, free from the chaos of his world. His family is powerful, and they would have torn us apart. I didn't want you caught in the middle of that." Emily stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor. "But I had a right to know. You took that choice away from me." The room was thick with emotion, both of them standing on opposite sides of the table, the distance between them feeling insurmountable. "I'm sorry," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible. "I thought I was protecting you. I thought I was making the best decision for both of us. I never wanted to hurt you." Emily's hands shook as she tried to process everything. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, teetering between anger and sorrow, unsure which way to fall. "I don't know what to do with this," Emily said, her voice hoarse. "I don't even know how to feel about Jason. I met him, and he didn't even know I existed. How could you let this happen?" Sarah walked around the table and reached for Emily's hand, her touch gentle but desperate. "I know it's a lot, and I know I should have told you sooner, but it's not too late. You can get to know him now, if that's what you want." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them back. She didn't know what she wanted. All she knew was that her life had changed irrevocably, and nothing would ever be the same. "I need time," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. I need to figure this out." Sarah nodded, her own tears falling as she let go of Emily's hand. "Take all the time you need. I'm here, whenever you're ready to talk." Emily grabbed her bag and headed for the door, her heart heavy with the weight of everything she had learned. As she stepped into the cool night air, she inhaled deeply, trying to clear her mind. But no matter how much distance she put between herself and her mother's apartment, one thing was clear. Her life had been shattered, and now, She was left to pick up the pieces. And somehow, Jason Blackwell was at the center of it all. Emily spent the next few days in a fog. Everywhere she turned, memories from her childhood flooded back, but now they felt different, tainted by the secrets she had just uncovered. Every time she thought of Jason, her father, her chest tightened. The man who had been a stranger in the rain now occupied every corner of her mind, and the mother she had always trusted felt distant, almost foreign. She hadn't spoken to Sarah since their argument. The words, "I need time," hung heavily between them. Sarah had given her space, but the silence weighed on Emily. She wasn't ready to face her mother yet, but she also couldn't stay stuck in the limbo of her thoughts. That's why, when Jason called her again, she didn't hesitate. It was time for answers, real answers, not the half-truths her mother had given her. Jason had suggested meeting at his office, a sleek high-rise in the heart of Manhattan, and as Emily stood outside the towering building, she felt a nervous energy buzzing through her. The lobby was as impressive as she'd imagined. Polished marble floors, modern art hanging on the walls, and a receptionist who gave her a knowing look as soon as Emily said her name. "Mr. Blackwell is expecting you," she said, directing Emily to a private elevator. The ride up was smooth, but Emily's pulse quickened with each floor. When the elevator doors opened, Jason was already waiting for her. He looked just as composed as the first time they'd met, but now there was a vulnerability in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "Emily," he greeted her, his voice soft but steady. "Thanks for coming." She nodded, not trusting herself to speak yet. He led her down a quiet corridor to a large office with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a sweeping view of the city. The room was all sleek lines and modern decor, but despite the luxury, it felt cold, sterile, much like the man who occupied it. Jason gestured for her to sit on one of the plush leather chairs, and he sat across from her, his eyes searching hers for a sign of where to begin. "I know this isn't easy," he started, his voice careful, "and I don't expect you to be okay with everything overnight, but I'm glad you're here." Emily leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "I don't know if I'm here for answers or closure," she said honestly, "but I need to understand. How could you not know? How could you not look for me?" Jason's jaw tightened, and he took a deep breath. "It's not that I didn't care, Emily. I didn't know. Your mother and I, we were young. My family was powerful, controlling. They had a plan for my life, and Sarah didn't fit into that plan. At the time, I thought I was doing what I had to. I thought I was protecting her, too." Emily's throat tightened. "Protecting her? Or protecting yourself?" Jason looked away for a moment, his expression hardening as if wrestling with an old, buried pain. "A little of both, I guess," he admitted quietly. "I wasn't brave enough to stand up to my family back then. I made mistakes. But when Sarah disappeared, I thought she'd moved on. I thought she made her choice to walk away. I had no idea she was pregnant. I swear." Emily wanted to believe him, but her heart still ached with the betrayal of it all. She said she was scared, that your family would have torn us apart. Jason nodded, his face heavy with regret. "She wasn't wrong. My father, he would have done anything to keep me focused on the business. But I was different then, Emily. I didn't know how to fight back." Emily stared out the window, the sprawling city below looking so small from up here. "And now? What are you fighting for now?" Jason's eyes softened as he leaned forward. "You. I'm fighting for you." The weight of his words hung between them, and for a moment, Emily didn't know what to say. Part of her wanted to believe him, to let herself imagine what a relationship with her father might look like. But another part of her was still angry. Angry that her mother had been left to raise her alone. Angry that Jason had lived his life in luxury while they struggled. "Why now?" Emily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you reach out after all this time?" Jason looked down, his fingers nervously tapping against the armrest. "I found out about you, by accident," he admitted. "My father passed away a few months ago. When we were going through his estate, I found letters from your mother, letters she'd written to me but never sent. It was the first time I realized what had happened, that I had a daughter." Emily's heart skipped a beat. Letters. More secrets. "I didn't know how to reach out," Jason continued, his voice filled with remorse. I didn't want to force myself into your life without warning. So, when we met that day, it wasn't planned. But after I saw you, after you mentioned the birthmark, I knew I couldn't wait any longer." Emily shook her head, her mind racing. So this was all just coincidence? Jason smiled faintly. Fate, maybe? She wasn't ready to accept that just yet. The idea that her life had been shaped by choices made decades ago, by people she barely knew, felt suffocating. She needed to know more. "What about your family now?" Emily asked, her voice tense. "If they didn't want us then, why would they accept me now?" Jason's smile faded, replaced by a serious look. "My father's gone. The power he held over me, over my life, died with him. No one else can stand in the way of what I want anymore." Emily frowned. "And what do you want, Jason?" "I want to make things right," Jason said, his voice filled with conviction. "I want to be part of your life, Emily. I missed out on so much already, and I don't want to lose any more time. But I know this is your choice. I'm not here to force anything. I just want you to know I'm here." Emily let his words sink in. She had dreamed of meeting her father as a child, imagining what he might be like. But nothing had prepared her for the reality of this moment, the messiness, the confusion, the flood of emotions she couldn't control. She looked at Jason, really looked at him, and for the first time, saw more than just the cold, powerful businessman. She saw a man who had made mistakes, a man who was trying to make amends. But she also saw someone who had the power to hurt her again if she let him too close. "I don't know what I want," Emily admitted, her voice soft but steady. "I don't know how to feel about any of this, but I'm willing to try. That's all I can promise right now." Jason's expression softened, a flicker of hope in his eyes. "That's more than I could have asked for." They sat there in silence for a moment, the weight of their shared history pressing down on them. It wasn't a perfect resolution, but it was a start. And for now, that was enough. As Emily stood to leave, Jason walked her to the door, the tension between them easing, if only slightly. Just before she stepped out, Jason placed a hand on her shoulder. "Thank you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice sincere, "for giving me a chance." She nodded, still unsure of what their future held, but for the first time, she felt a glimmer of something she hadn't expected, possibility. As the elevator doors closed, Emily stared at her reflection in the mirrored walls, her mind still spinning. She had come for answers, and while she didn't have them all yet, one thing was clear. Her life was no longer defined by the past. What happened next was up to her. And for the first time, that thought didn't terrify her. It empowered her. The days after her meeting with Jason were a whirlwind of emotions for Emily. She found herself caught between two worlds, her past with her mother, built on a foundation of love but shadowed by secrets, and this new reality with Jason, her father, a man she barely knew but who now occupied a central place in her life. She spent hours replaying their conversation in her mind, scrutinizing every word, every glance, searching for any sign of deception or insincerity. But despite her doubts, Jason's words had seemed genuine. He wasn't trying to make excuses or shift blame. He was just a man who had missed his chance to know her and was now hoping to fix what had been broken. Still, it wasn't easy to let go of the resentment she felt. Even though Jason wasn't entirely to blame for their estrangement, Emily couldn't shake the anger she held toward him, or her mother, for that matter. She felt like a pawn in a game she hadn't even known she was playing. Her mother had taken away her choice, and Jason had failed to fight for her in the first place. Now, she was the one left to pick up the pieces. That weekend, Emily finally decided to go home to Sarah's apartment. Her mother had been calling, sending messages asking if she was okay, but Emily hadn't responded. She didn't know how to explain the storm of emotions swirling inside her without triggering another fight. But she knew that avoiding her mother forever wasn't an option. When Emily walked through the front door, Sarah was waiting for her in the living room. The tension between them was palpable, and the air felt thick with unspoken words. Sarah looked up from the couch, her face etched with worry, but there was also relief in her eyes. "Emily," Sarah said softly, standing as if she wasn't sure whether to hug her or keep her distance. Emily dropped her keys on the table and met her mother's gaze, her stomach churning. "We need to talk." Sarah nodded, her face pale. I know. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, just like they had during Emily's childhood, except this time, the distance between them felt vast. Emily took a deep breath, the anger and confusion she'd been holding inside spilling out before she could stop herself. I met him, she said bluntly. Jason, I met my father. Sarah's face blanched, and for a second, she seemed to stop breathing. You what? He called me. After I found the letter, I met with him, Emily continued, her voice trembling despite her attempt to stay calm. And he told me everything. About your relationship. About why you left. Sarah's hands shook, and she clasped them together tightly. Emily, why didn't you tell me? Emily interrupted, her voice cracking. You kept this huge part of my life from me. You lied, Mom. My entire life. You let me believe. I wasn't trying to lie to you, Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. I was trying to protect you. I didn't want you to grow up feeling like you weren't wanted, or like you were caught between two worlds. But I am caught between two worlds, Emily shot back. And now I'm stuck trying to figure out who I am because you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth. Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, but Emily was too angry to let her mother's sorrow soften her resolve. She had been the one living in the dark, and she wasn't ready to forgive that. Not yet. I'm sorry, Sarah whispered, her voice breaking. I thought I was doing what was best. Jason and we had so many problems, and his family was so controlling. I didn't want you to get hurt by their mess. I didn't want you to feel abandoned by someone who wasn't capable of loving you the way you deserved. Emily swallowed hard, her throat tight with unshed tears. But you didn't give me the chance to make that choice for myself. You decided what was best for me, and now I don't even know who I am. Jason wants to be in my life, and I don't know if I can let him. I don't know if I want him to be. Sarah wiped at her tears, her expression filled with regret. I understand why you're angry, Emily, and you have every right to be. I should have told you the truth, but I was scared. Scared of losing you, scared of what it would mean for both of us if Jason came back into our lives. Emily sat in silence, trying to process her mother's words. She could see now that Sarah had been driven by fear, by the desire to protect her from the complexities of their family's past. But that didn't make it any easier to accept. The damage had already been done. I don't know what to do, Emily admitted, her voice small and fragile. I don't know how to move forward from this. Sarah reached across the table, gently taking Emily's hand in hers. You don't have to figure it all out right away, she said softly. But whatever you decide, I'll be here. I just want you to know that I love you, more than anything. That's why I made the choices I did, right or wrong. I did it because I love you. Emily felt a lump rise in her throat, the weight of her mother's words pressing down on her chest. She knew her mother had always loved her, fiercely, protectively, but that love had come at a cost, and now they were both paying for it. I know, Emily whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I know you love me. They sat in silence for a few minutes, the tension between them easing slightly. The anger hadn't completely dissipated, but something had shifted. Emily could feel the first stirrings of forgiveness, though it would take time for that feeling to fully settle. Later that night, after the conversation with her mother had left her emotionally drained, Emily found herself lying in bed, staring at the ceiling. Her mind drifted back to Jason. She hadn't told her mother about his offer to be part of her life, about how he was fighting for a second chance. The thought of it made her heart ache with both possibility and uncertainty. Could she let him in? Could she build a relationship with the man who had been absent for so long? Just as she was about to close her eyes, her phone buzzed. It was a text from Jason. Asterisk, I'm thinking about you. No rush on anything. Just wanted you to know I'm here, whenever you're ready. Asterisk. Emily stared at the message for a long time, her thumb hovering over the keyboard. She wanted to respond, to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, she set the phone down, closing her eyes as she tried to shut out the confusion swirling in her mind. But even in the quiet darkness of her room, one thought kept pushing its way to the surface. She wasn't sure if she was ready for Jason to be part of her life. But for the first time, she realized she wanted to try. That, at least, was a start. The next morning, Emily woke up with a sense of clarity she hadn't felt in weeks. Though the weight of everything still hung heavy in her chest, there was a decision forming in her mind. One she knew she had to follow through on. She couldn't ignore Jason forever, nor could she keep living in the shadow of the secrets that had defined her life. After a few moments of staring at the ceiling, Emily grabbed her phone. The message Jason had sent the night before still sat unanswered, a quiet reminder that he was waiting, but not pressuring her. His words had been simple, but they had stayed with her. I'm here, whenever you're ready. She didn't know if she was truly ready, but she was willing to try. With her fingers trembling slightly, she typed out a response. I think it's time we talk. Can we meet this weekend? She hit send before she could overthink it, her heart pounding in her chest. Almost immediately, the familiar 3 dots appeared on the screen, signaling that Jason was typing back. Moments later, his reply came through. Of course. I'll make time for whenever you're free. Just tell me the place. Emily stared at the message, realizing that she held the power now. For so long, her life had felt out of her control, defined by other people's choices. But now, she was the one making the decisions. She had to choose where this relationship would go, if it would go anywhere at all. That weekend, they met at a quiet cafe just outside of Central Park. It was the kind of place that Emily had always loved, cozy, warm, with large windows that overlooked the city's greenery. She arrived a few minutes early, feeling jittery, and chose a small table in the corner. As she waited, she tried to keep herself calm, reminding herself that this was just a conversation, nothing more. When Jason arrived, she saw him before he saw her. Tall, composed, his suit perfectly tailored as usual. But there was something softer about him today. Maybe it was the absence of the cold corporate walls, or the way his eyes seemed less guarded. Either way, when he spotted her and smiled, it wasn't the confident smile of a businessman. It was the nervous smile of a man trying to reconnect with something he thought he had lost. Hi, Jason said as he sat down, his voice warm but cautious. Hi, Emily replied, giving him a small, tentative smile in return. She had so many questions, but for now, she just wanted to let the moment breathe. For a few minutes, they talked about surface-level things, the weather, the city, the cafe itself. Jason asked about her job, her interests, and though it felt strange at first, Emily found herself easing into the conversation. There was still a lingering tension between them, but it wasn't as sharp as before. It was more of a quiet unease, the kind that comes from 2 people trying to rebuild something that had never existed in the first place. After a while, Emily leaned forward slightly, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup. I've been thinking a lot, she said quietly, her eyes fixed on the table. About you. About us. Jason's expression softened, and he nodded for her to continue. I don't know if I'm ready to just accept everything, she admitted, her voice faltering. I'm still angry. I'm still hurt, but I also know that avoiding you forever isn't going to help either of us. I guess what I'm saying is, I want to try. I want to figure out who you are, who we are. Jason exhaled, relief washing over his face. Emily, I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I know I've missed so much, your entire life, really, and I can't make up for that, but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to be in your life now, if you'll let me. Emily met his eyes, and for the first time, she saw something in him that she hadn't seen before, a vulnerability that mirrored her own. He wasn't the untouchable, powerful figure she had imagined. He was just a man, trying to piece together the broken parts of his past. I don't want to rush anything, she said, her voice soft but firm. I need time to figure this out, but I also know that I want to get to know you, even if it's one step at a time. Jason nodded, his eyes filled with understanding. One step at a time, he repeated. That's all I'm asking for. They sat in silence for a moment, the noise of the cafe buzzing around them, but the space between them felt lighter now, less burdened by the weight of the past. Emily felt a small sense of relief wash over her. Like for the first time in weeks, she could breathe again. As they continued to talk, the conversation shifted to stories of Jason's life, the things he had experienced, the places he had been, and the mistakes he had made along the way. He spoke openly about his regrets, particularly about not standing up to his family when he should have. But he also talked about his successes, his businesses, and the work he had done to distance himself from his father's control. Emily listened, intrigued by the life her father had led, a life she had never been part of but was now slowly learning about. There were still moments when the old resentment flared up, but for now, she let herself simply be curious. She asked him questions, and he answered them with patience and honesty. At one point, Jason pulled out his phone and showed her a picture of his mother, a woman Emily had never seen before but whose features she could recognize in her own face. "She would have loved you," Jason said softly, his voice tinged with sadness. "She always wanted grandkids." Emily smiled faintly, unsure of how to respond. There were so many layers to their connection, so many emotions that she hadn't yet unpacked. But as she looked at the photo, she felt a strange sense of belonging. Like there was a place for her in this story, even if it had taken years to find it. As the afternoon stretched on, they left the cafe and walked through Central Park together, the conversation flowing more easily now. Emily found herself laughing at Jason's stories of his early business ventures, the awkward mistakes he had made in his youth, and the lessons he had learned along the way. By the time they reached the edge of the park, the sun was beginning to set, casting a warm glow over the trees. They stood together, watching the light fade, and for the first time, Emily felt a sense of peace she hadn't expected. "Thank you for today," Jason said quietly, turning to face her. "I know this isn't easy for you, and I'm grateful you're giving me a chance." Emily nodded, her heart still conflicted but lighter than it had been in weeks. "I guess I'm just trying to figure out what this means," she admitted. "For both of us." Jason smiled, his eyes filled with a quiet hope. "It means we get to start over. Maybe not as father and daughter right away, but as two people who want to know each other. We can figure out the rest as we go." Emily looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw not just the man who had missed so much, but the man who was trying to make things right. "I think I'd like that," she said softly. They stood there for a while, side by side, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would still be challenges to face. But for the first time, Emily felt like she was no longer standing at the edge of the cliff, ready to fall. She was taking her first steps into something new, something that, despite everything, felt like the beginning of a chance at healing. And for now, that was enough. The weeks that followed were a delicate balancing act for Emily. Slowly, carefully, she allowed Jason into her life, piece by piece. They kept things casual, meeting for coffee, taking walks in the park, and talking for hours about everything and nothing. Each conversation felt like pulling back another layer, revealing more of who Jason was, and in turn, more of who she was, now that she knew the truth. It wasn't easy. Some days, the weight of their shared past still hung heavy between them. Emily couldn't forget the years of absence, the missed birthdays, the moments where a father's presence should have been felt. But Jason was patient. He didn't push for more than she was willing to give, and that gave Emily the space she needed to navigate her emotions. Her relationship with Sarah, however, was still on shaky ground. Despite the conversation they'd had, Emily couldn't shake the lingering resentment. She loved her mother, but the secrets Sarah had kept weighed on her, and each time they spoke, the unspoken words between them built a wall Emily wasn't ready to tear down yet. One evening, after another quiet dinner at her mother's apartment, Emily found herself wandering the streets of New York, her mind restless. The city was alive with its usual energy, people rushing past, car horns blaring, lights from the skyscrapers illuminating the night. But Emily felt detached from it all, lost in her own thoughts. As she walked, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and saw a message from Jason. Asterisk, "Can we talk? I need to tell you something important." Asterisk, her heart skipped a beat. She hadn't heard that tone from Jason before. Their conversations had been light so far, carefully avoiding the deeper, more painful parts of their history. But now, there was a weight in his words that made her stomach turn with anxiety. Without hesitation, she replied, Asterisk, "Sure. Where?" Asterisk, Jason's response came quickly. Asterisk, My office. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon? Asterisk. Emily stared at the message for a moment, her mind racing. She had been to his office once before, but this felt different. Whatever Jason had to say, it was clear it wasn't something that could be discussed over coffee. The next day, Emily made her way to Jason's office, her nerves tightening with every step. As she rode the elevator up to the top floor, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to shift again. She wasn't sure she was ready for more revelations, but she knew she couldn't avoid them forever. When she arrived, Jason was waiting for her in his office, just like before. But this time, the air felt different, heavier, more tense. He stood by the window, his back to her, staring out at the city below. "Hey," Emily said softly, stepping into the room. Jason turned, offering her a small, strained smile. "Emily, thanks for coming." She sat down, feeling the knot in her stomach tighten. "What's going on? You said you needed to talk?" Jason nodded, his expression serious as he walked over and sat across from her. "There's something I haven't told you yet. Something I've been struggling with since the day we met." Emily's heart raced. She had braced herself for more difficult truths, but she wasn't sure she was ready for this. "What is it?" Jason took a deep breath, his hands clasped together tightly. "It's about my father. About why your mother left when she was pregnant." Emily's throat tightened. This was the part of the story she hadn't fully understood. The part Sarah had glossed over with vague explanations about pressure and family control. She leaned forward, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean?" Jason's eyes darkened as he spoke, his voice low and filled with regret. "My father, he was a powerful man, controlling. He had plans for my life, plans that didn't include your mother. When she told me she was pregnant, I wanted to be with her. I wanted to raise you, to fight for our family. But my father," he intervened. Emily's breath caught in her throat. "What do you mean, intervened?" "He threatened her." "Emily," Jason said, his voice heavy with guilt. "He told her that if she stayed with me, he'd destroy her. He had the power to do it, too. He had lawyers, connections, and money, more than she could ever fight against. I didn't know what he was doing at the time, but he made sure she felt like she had no choice but to leave." Emily's hands gripped the edge of her chair as Jason's words sunk in. "He forced her to leave?" Jason nodded, his expression pained. "She didn't want you to grow up in a family where you'd be used as leverage, where you'd always be under his thumb. She thought she was protecting you, and in a way, she was." Tears pricked at Emily's eyes as she tried to process what Jason was telling her. All these years, she had blamed her mother for keeping secrets, for making the choice to leave Jason. But now, she was learning that Sarah had been trapped, forced into making an impossible decision to protect her child from a man who would have torn their lives apart. "I didn't know," Jason continued, his voice cracking. "I didn't know until years later, after she had already gone. By the time I found out what my father had done, it was too late. She was gone, and you were born, and I didn't know how to fix it." Emily's tears spilled over as the weight of his confession hit her. She had spent so long resenting both of them, her mother for leaving and Jason for not being there. But now, everything was shifting again. The anger she had held onto for so long began to crack, replaced by an overwhelming sadness for what they had all lost. "I'm so sorry," Jason whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "If I could go back and change things, I would. I would have fought harder. I would have stood up to him. But I was weak, and I didn't see the truth until it was too late." Emily wiped at her tears, her heart aching for the man sitting in front of her. He had been just as trapped as her mother, caught in a web of power and control that had torn their family apart before it even had a chance to exist. "I don't know what to say," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. "I've spent my whole life wondering why things happened the way they did. And now I don't know how to feel." Jason looked at her with eyes full of regret, but also hope. "I know I can't fix the past, but I want to make things right, Emily. I want to be there for you now, in whatever way you'll let me. I'm not asking for forgiveness right away. I just want the chance to prove that I'm not the man my father was." Emily's heart ached with the complexity of it all. She wasn't ready to forgive, not completely, but she could see the sincerity in Jason's eyes, the pain he carried for the mistakes he had made. And despite everything, part of her wanted to believe that they could find a way forward. After a long moment of silence, Emily finally spoke. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive," she admitted, her voice soft but steady. "But I'm ready to try." Jason's eyes filled with gratitude, and for the first time, Emily saw a flicker of hope between them. The road ahead was still uncertain, still full of unanswered questions and unresolved emotions. But for the first time, she felt like they were both standing on the same side, ready to face whatever came next, together. As she stood to leave, Jason walked her to the door, his expression lighter than when she had first arrived. "Thank you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice filled with emotion, "for giving me a chance." Emily nodded, her heart still heavy but no longer burdened by the same anger that had consumed her before. "I think we both deserve a second chance," she said softly, and as she stepped into the elevator and the doors closed behind her, Emily felt something shift inside her, something small but powerful. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was the beginning of healing. And for now, that was enough.